All right. So, welcome. This is where we dump the entire club's knowledge on you in 2 hours. Hopefully not 2 hours actually, but this is going to be basically a overview of just navigation in general. This is kind of important because navigation is obviously quite complex, and it's kind of hard to grasp what the goals of any small partition of it is without understanding what are we trying to do, how do we generally break down the problem, and especially since most of you are in TinyCart right now, hopefully this will inspire your design choices a little, because even if you don't use these techniques, and these are quite high level, you can take inspiration from one or more components and start integrating those into your design. Since these automation is actually quite an old field. These things have been used for well over a century, or not a century, well over a few decades at this point. So hopefully they can help you out on that endeavor. This is right. There we go. All right, so here's an itinerary. There's a lot of things here, but we'll be basically going through, starting from, actually sensors isn't on that, that's a lie, starting at odometry and ending with path tracking. So basically, what we're trying to do here, and what navigation in general is trying to do, is simply get from point A to point B. That's all it is. Now, getting from point A to point B in the real world is obviously quite complex, because you can't just drive through things. That doesn't go well, historically, anyways. So really what navigation is about, getting from point A to point B, but also fulfilling criteria. So generally it's not hitting things, but also things like if you're in a car, you want to obey speed limits. A lot of cases you want to have things like pedestrian safety. It's like, especially in autonomous vehicles, you want to try to avoid going near people, even if you're not necessarily going to hit them. And so navigation is just trying to do this path finding task essentially while fulfilling those criteria. And as we'll see, it's even just doing that is quite complex to the amount of variables that come into play on figuring out where are you, where is the goal, where are things about you. And so that's really what this whole field is about. So the first thing we'll touch on, and this is like the most simple form of navigation you can have, is simply odometry. So essentially odometry is just measuring where you are based off purely sensor readings and nothing else. So generally this is going to be found simply with dead reckoning. So dead reckoning is essentially just like you have some, say, like wheel encoders, something we'll go over as like sensors in a second. But basically you'll just accept what it says, how far you've gone as truth, add that to running total of where you've gone, and that's where you say where you are. So essentially odometry is always going to be your measurement of where you think you are relative to where you started, because of course you can't orient yourself, say, like to a landmark. So let's say there's like some landmarks you want to call 0. Odometry is just going to be relative to wherever you turned on the robot and nothing else, because you're just counting what your sensors tell you. Even though this is simple, this is actually incredibly important. Pretty much all of navigation is built upon this, because it gives us really useful statistical starting points for other algorithms. And I should mention real quick, in ROS, we haven't touched on frames yet, but in ROS, when I say like all the points are relative to where you turned on the robot, in ROS this is known as the odometry frame. So this is something to keep in mind, because you'll see that come up a lot once you start actually trying to use these concepts in code. So just as an example of this, that green path up there would be like where your robot actually went. That red path would be where your odometry says you are at any time. So you can see, because you're just raw counting sensors, it drifts a lot. It's pretty sporadic. It's got a pretty good gist. So if like you only had odometry, it's still better than nothing. But you can see it's definitely not the most accurate. And then below that we see this is the actual ROS like variable odometry, ROS message odometry. And that simply has, if you see the pose with covariance member, that's just where we are at any time. And then twist with covariance is essentially your velocities. So, angular velocity, linear velocity, acceleration, that kind of thing. And so that's how ROS defines odometry. I want to mention that odometry isn't the strictly defined thing. This annoyed me a lot trying to research. But generally, it's the notion of basically just what our sensors are telling us is a good way to just kind of think about it. And speaking of which, Odom is probably the most flexible out of any part of navigation, in that you can get it from a lot of places. So probably the 3 biggest I've seen are encoders, which read wheel speeds, and this is generally good for linear velocity, linear acceleration, because wheels like to go straight. And then IMUs, which are just a combo accelerometer, gyroscope, that's what it's called, and magnometer. So this is best for figuring out your angular accelerations, because that's best at measuring roll pitch yaw. But it can also be used for linear stuff as well. It's just going to accumulate error really quickly, unlike wheel encoders. So generally, you're going to combine these. I'll show you how to do that in a second to kind of cancel them out. But then there's a third type that you don't see as much until you start working with robots a bit more. But that's visual inertial odometry, which is those, if you've seen, actually, the camera that's recording me can do this, and the little Intel Real Senses. Basically, it combines an IMU and a camera, and basically tracks, given a camera frame and given another camera frame, we want to find out what's the physical translation between the points in those images. This is known as optical flow in particular. Basically, if we can find the change between those camera frames, we can basically estimate how far we moved in between those camera frames. This is really interesting because unlike IMU and encoders, it doesn't really have natural drift. It just has the issues of cameras themselves. So like at night, this doesn't work. We found that out with 2 separate robots and we still made the mistake because of course it has the issues of cameras. Whereas like a wheel encoder doesn't care how dark it is outside, it's just magnets. But it's nice because it can avoid some of the issues like with slip. It just doesn't care. It's a camera. It doesn't have wheel slip. So it's just an interesting option that you should keep in mind. So one of the big issues I mentioned, every sensor has a lot of drift. VIO is a bit of an exception, but it's also just a bit of an exception in general. But both IMUs and encoders are going to be very error prone over time, so you really can't just rely on the raw reading themselves. So it turns out there's an entire field dedicated to solving this issue, which is basically, I have a noisy sensor input, where is it actually based off of past observations? It's called state estimation. I'm not going to go too deep into it here because it is an entire field of statistics, but essentially that's the idea. Is you given a bunch of noisy inputs, we can use statistics to estimate what our actual output is. So you can see on the bottom right corner there, this little graph of a blue noisy sensor. So like you could say, this could even be like your estimated velocity from our wheel encoder. And then that red line is after state estimation, the smoothing effect. So you can see your velocity won't be jumping all over the place from the sensor reading because it's smoothed it out. So when we do state estimation with multiple different inputs, we call this sensor fusion because that's how we combine things like wheel encoders and IMUs to offset their issues. I think we mentioned this earlier on, but more specifically, because I don't think we actually really got into depth last time, Kalman filters are probably the most common implementation I've seen. It's what Ross uses. And so essentially, a Kalman filter is just a filter that estimates, or filter I should mention, generally the term filter is used to say that we're filtering a noisy inputs, like, we're removing the noise, essentially. We're filtering the noise out. So Kalman filters specifically in statistical terms, don't worry if you don't know the stats, but just so you know, they're basically, they operate on continuous random variables where everything, mainly our error, is assumed to be normally distributed. Classically, you can assume basically everything is normally distributed to some extent. And so they're pretty general, pretty widely used. And generally as well, these don't just estimate one variable at a time. Rather, you measure essentially all of what we would call the robot's state. So essentially, that's going to be your, not necessarily position all the time, but especially your velocities, your roll pitch yaw, heading, stuff like that. And so when using this in something like Ross, thankfully there's already a package that does it. I don't go too in depth on like how you Kalman filter here because it's quite complicated. But there's a package known as Robot Localization that implements multiple different kinds of Kalman filters. Generally, you can just use that. It has like all 18. It's an 18th dimensional matrix actually of what it predicts, because those are your 18. Like I mentioned, roll pitch yaw, acceleration, that kind of stuff. There are 18 of those. So again, I'm not going to get too into how Kalman filters work here. That's better done in its own presentation. But if you're interested, there's this amazing website called, I think it's like learnkalman.net or something. It's surprisingly not too bad. It's pretty readable. I'd recommend it just to go through it. Actually, oh, he's not on it. I thought the guy in the video was on it. It's actually pretty simple to understand, and especially once you get to working with Kalman filters, it'll help clear things up a lot. Then I did actually find this neat little video that would actually demonstrate a little more about what I'm trying to get to here. So this guy, he has his little burger bot here. Notice it just has 2 wheels. He's just measuring his position using these 2 wheels. So then I believe this first example is without a filter. So you can see robot gets caught up in the rug here. And see its wheels on the rug. Watch what happens to its position in the map. You can see it's barely moving, but it's absolutely lost. Like the room is not correctly oriented at all. And this is because he's relying purely on the reading from the encoder. But of course the odometry is drifting because the encoder is drifting, or encoder is just reading bad data basically. So then later on, he actually uses that exact package I mentioned here. And then I believe what he does is he adds an IMU to the mix. So now he's using both an IMU and an encoder, feeding them through the Kalman filter. And then we will see when the robot... Oh, no. No, go back. Oh, come on. There we go. See, the robot gets caught up in the rug, but even though it's spinning, it's staying relatively consistent. And that's because it's using those IMU readings to even out all of the bad error from the encoders. And so I show this because this is going to become incredibly relevant for Tiny Cart because the floor downstairs is polished concrete. Essentially the whole floor is that carpet. So this is why I highly recommend having 2 sources of odometry, or at least one that isn't an encoder mainly, because you will very quickly run into that issue. And that's going to be something that pretty much everyone's going to have to implement in some form. So this also brings us to the point. Cool, so we filtered it. We have a relative image. As you saw, that's actually a pretty accurate way to track, how the robot's state is. Why can we not just navigate with that? I say this, it's probably obvious to all of you, if you've been here this long, as why you can't just navigate based purely off where you started. But as I've heard from the senior design classes, turns out a lot of people are actually still very confused about this. And so there's 2 main issues. One, even with state estimators, odometry does pretty significantly drift over time. So there's a technique we'll cover later on called localization that can correct for this. But mainly, it doesn't obviously contain any information about obstacles. So even if we can say we have a goal 10 meters in front of us, go. Odometry only has the state about us. We don't know where anything else is, so we can't actually do any planning. And so pretty much the entire rest of this presentation and the rest of navigation is just solving this issue of how do we actually know what's around us. And so to do this, we of course, computer please. We of course need a map. So in terms of robotics, a map is simply just a representation of the state of the environment around us. If you read into this at all, literature likes to call it the state of the world. But essentially a map it's exactly as you'd expect. You can see like down here on the left corner, I found a paper that was talking about like autonomous boats. And it has this nice little picture of a grid of like a bay with some things are piers, some things are like a dock. And that's generally actually how we're going to represent the world. It's just as a grid. There are things on the grid. Pretty simple, honestly. You can see on the bottom right, though, once you get into 3D, it gets way wilder because everything's a voxel. And so you have really nice point cloud diagrams like that one there. Thankfully, you won't have to deal with that. So you'll actually just be able to use an occupancy grid. So an occupancy grid is very simple. It's essentially just if you think in code, it's just a 2D array in the 2D sense, or in a 2D environment at least, of cells, where each cell is either occupied or not. And so generally for what I imagine you guys are doing, you'll probably have this as either something's there or something's not. But in more advanced implementations, you can have there's a probability of there being something here or not, which makes it a bit more flexible. And so this is what is the basis of pretty much all navigation from what I can tell, but especially ROS. And if you go to RViz and see a thing like it's on the screen there, those black lines are the occupancy grid, or in ROS it's under the map topic. If you ever see map, think occupancy grid. And so you can see as well in the ROS implementation, I'm not 100% on this, but I believe the like little more grayed out areas are those areas that have less readings, so it has a lower probability of it being free, because we're not 100% sure yet, which is interesting. But then, of course, the black areas are walls. And so in pretty much every robotic implementation you'll see, you don't just use the raw map, because the raw map, while it does have a lot of information, generally isn't great to navigate on, because as we'll see later in planning, a lot of planners will essentially like to hug the wall. And while that is technically doable, a lot of the time you don't want your robot to just be hugging the wall at all times. It's just not very safe. So each implementation will kind of do their own thing, and it's something I want to emphasize a little. Costmaps, from what I can tell, are specifically, at least the word Costmap is specifically a ROS thing. This confused me a lot because I could find only ROS things about it and no like formal definition. But this is because Costmaps are essentially just going to be a layer built on top of an occupancy grid rather than their own thing itself. So rather, it's just something, literally a layer on top of the occupancy grid in terms of like abstractions. So specifically, what an occupancy grid or a cost map rather actually is, it's simply essentially another occupancy grid, but instead of there being a chance of something being occupied, it's a cost of basically how much do we want this robot to be here. So generally, you're going to see 100% cost on walls because we don't want it to be in the wall. That's bad. But you can do pretty much whatever you want to apply cost to random places to ease the robot away from them. So generally, you're going to have what in ROS is called the inflation layer to essentially inflate costs around obstacles. So like you can see in that image there, the pink is 100% cost, so we really don't want the robot to be there. The blue is lower cost. So essentially, the robot can be here, but we still don't want it to because we want to ease it away from the wall. That's essentially the idea. Costmaps are very important. Do not ignore them if you're using any sort of planning algorithm in your implementations. Because what they do, as I mentioned earlier, is they keep it away from the wall. So we saw this with our last robot, Kilo. We didn't have this. We didn't realize we were supposed to add a bunch of costs to the world. And it loved to cut corners, which is bad because cutting corners meant hitting things, because there's always error and always account for error. So this is just something, again, I can't emphasize this enough. Add cost if you're using something like an inflation layer, because as long as you have a gradient, it'll just help smooth everything else out. And then I guess I should mention as well, in ROS, but this is more of just a real life thing, you can do more than just inflation. So like one of the big things I've seen is with humans. So like let's say you have a pedestrian and you're like have a projected path for that pedestrian. You could essentially project that path out as cost. So you could say, oh, this person may be in this area. Let's preemptively try to plan around where they could be so that we stay away from people, again, accounting for that error. So just more ideas of what you can do with this. This is a very flexible idea that you can really apply to your individual issue pretty broadly. All right, so up to now, we have Odom, which is our relative position to where we started, as well as just generally we know our velocity. That's pretty useful in general. We have a map, so we know the state of the world. Conveniently, a map is also a coordinate system because they're generally grids. So essentially now we have a reference of, we can say something is at absolute, like let's say grid square 2112, and we know the size of each grid square, so we know in real like meters where something is in the world. This is important because now we can localize. And so localization is essentially just finding our exact position in that map. So if odometry, again, is general to where, or relative to where we started, then localization is our position relative to the map we've mapped around us. So I say semi-global on the slide. Technically, if you're going to like travel to Spain, this isn't global localization because that means that you'd had to map the whole world and then you get into weird stuff. But in the anything you would have to deal with, it's essentially your global position in the world. So localization is very important. Because if you think of the problem of getting from A to B, A is us. We need to know where A is before we can get to B. And if we only have Odom, which is relative to where we started, that's not very useful unless, of course, we know exactly where we started. Unfortunately, localization is where this starts to get really complicated. Because finding out purely off sensor readings where you are in a map is actually quite complicated. And so they're split up into two techniques, or two like general categories, I would say. And that's if you have a map ahead of time and if you have to generate a map as you move. And so we'll start on if you've already have a map. And these are going to be much simpler. I know some teams were already talking about doing this. And however you're doing it, having a map ahead of time is always easier than trying to generate one at runtime. And so there's a couple techniques that you can use to localize if you're on a map that you already have. And so just briefly, again, you don't need to know all of like the details here. It's just names to think about. There are particle filters. So particle filters are what you see in the bottom right. Essentially what a particle filter is it's another statistical technique. But it essentially just creates a bunch of positions in the world of, given some sensor reading, where could we be? And then over time, it iterates down and narrows down all those points of where you could be until it has a cluster of points that it thinks you're really likely to be at. So if you can see, that little green circle is a robot. Those red points are places where you could be. So once it cycles, you can see a ton of places we can be. As it reads more sensors from its laser, you can see it narrows it down slowly. And then right about here, I think, now it's pretty confident in where it actually is in the world. And so this only works because it's a static map, so the world isn't changing around you. But given that, this is actually incredibly fast. It looks slow in the animation, but in code, this is like maybe 40, 50 lines. It's actually very simple. And honestly, it's just pretty good in general. Ross has an implementation called AMCL, which is, I think it's amortized Monte Carlo localization or something like that. Then there are two other ways you can do it. One is with Bayes filters. I'm not really going to get into this, but this is what's taught in the AI course here. So I just wanted to mention it. Honestly, it seems really inefficient in the real world. I'd probably just use a particle filter. But it's essentially the same thing. If you're estimating your probability of being at any place at any time, and then because of just Bayes' rule, that will slowly converge onto where you actually are in the world. So just another way you can do it. I know this is used a bit historically as well. And then my favorite technique, which I kept finding in papers, is that you just don't at all, and you just get a really good GPS, and the GPS says you're here, and you say, thanks GPS, I'm here. And that's it, which sounds silly, but if you think about, especially in autonomous vehicles, like in not, the stupid RC cars, but like a real car, this makes sense, actually, because provided you have a strong GPS signal, which is, definitely a thing you have to think about, trying to map literally the entire world is hard and not possible. So being able to just say, I'm exactly here, and just forget about localization is incredibly convenient. And honestly, like even looking back at our past projects, we probably should have relied a little more on this because it's just, GPS is reliable nowadays. Unfortunately, this doesn't work in indoors, which is a big downside. In industry, this is because warehouses are where most of robotics or autonomous robotics is nowadays, from what I can tell. And of course, for Tiny Cart, we're inside, so you can't just slap a big GPS on it. I'm sorry. But nonetheless, it's still a very effective technique. And so, as I've been kind of mentioning, these are lovely. These techniques are actually not hard to do, in my opinion. If you really read into them a little, they're pretty simple. The issue is that, of course, we don't have everything mapped out from the start. If you're, again, in like a real world scenario, a lot of things deal with exploration. So in like the warehouse scenario, it's actually pretty reasonable to map out the whole thing ahead of time. Autonomous vehicle, even, you kind of can. But there's a lot of scenarios, especially for like military stuff, where like you want to be going out into the middle of the desert where you can't have everything mapped. And so in this scenario, you run into the unfortunate problem of you need a map. You also need to know where you are in the map. How do you do that? Because you need to figure out where you are in a world you don't have yet, and then simultaneously find that world. Surprisingly, this is possible. I don't know how. Never mind, I do know how. It's SLAM. That's how you do it. SLAM is black magic and insane. But it's also incredibly important because it makes modern robotics like viable. It's also how you generally map in the first place, I should mention, because if you're generating those static maps, unless you literally hand draw the map, which is actually something you can do and isn't actually that insane, because if you do proper measurements, especially with like lasers or something, like you can get pretty accurate. But if you're mapping like the Tiny Cart course, I would just use SLAM and then just save a map. But anyways, SLAM is important. It's, as the name implies, you're simultaneously localizing and mapping. So you're finding your absolute position in a map and you're defining the map at the same time. Which means you can use it anywhere. You don't need to know the map. As long as there are things to detect and a sensor to detect them with, you can make a map. Something I should mention though, simultaneous localization and mapping isn't possible because it turns out our computers are not that good. So really every algorithm is just approximating simultaneous localization mapping. So it's like really close localization and mapping. But nonetheless, it's pretty accurate nowadays. It's had like a couple decades to get good, which is useful for us. And so generally, there's a lot of sensors you can use for this. If you go to this SLAM wiki article, they have some very interesting SLAM algorithms. My favorite being RAT-SLAM. I like RAT-SLAM. It's SLAM they reproduced from a rat's brain and made it an algorithm. Go figure. But you can use a lot of things. So generally, you're going to, on TinyCart, and most people in industry use lasers because lasers are just, they're good. They go through a lot. They go far. They aren't visible, which is convenient. They're durable. They're just good in general. They're kind of expensive, which is the issue. Also, they don't deal with vibration very well, which is another issue. But those two aside, they're pretty reliable. There are some interesting implementations, though, mainly with Roomba. Roomba's cool. Roomba, it has a couple of limitations. Some of them are vSLAM, but you can also just map the world by bumping things, it turns out. So if your only measurement is you bump something, there's something there, and bump things enough, you will eventually do SLAM, which is very cute. And that's how I believe the earlier Roomba models worked, and like the little DIY Roomba you can buy actually works like that. So as I mentioned, there's a couple ways you can do this. This is more of a just terms you should be aware of than any sort of recommendations. But it looks like historically there's really two techniques that have been used for this. The first is Bayes filters. I don't know specifically how this works, to be perfectly honest. But these use, in many cases, literally Kalman filters. We mentioned earlier for state estimation. Turns out you can state estimate where you are in the world. Again, not 100% on how that works, but nonetheless, it's pretty interesting. And then nowadays, and by nowadays I mean like after 2010 or so, the most SLAM techniques will use factor graphs, which is just another statistical data structure. It's a graph with like probabilities and stuff. Again, not going to get into it. Very complicated. But you'll see these terms a lot in packages describing how the SLAM works. Generally, you're going to prefer graph SLAM because it turns out it's easier to store a graph of where the robot's been than the probability of things existing everywhere at all times, which is how the first one works. So generally, you'll see, I wrote down like some examples here. These are just the most common ROS packages I've seen that use these two techniques. So of the older ones, you'll see Gmapping and Hector, especially if you're using ROS1 for whatever reason. You'll see these a ton. Most of the demos still have them. Both of these are pretty bad, I'll be honest, especially Hector, because it doesn't use Odometry at all. But that's just because they're using an older technique. So then post 2010, again, I mentioned ROS, if you don't know, was actually made prior to 2010. So like these literally didn't exist at the time. There's really three big packages I can find. The first is Carto, yeah. Which seems to be the basis for most other ones. This is like the first algorithm that came out and open source that used this new technique. After that was Google Cartographers, the first one you might have heard of if you've been in the club for a little, because we were trying to use it for a while. Problem is Google Googled and got rid of it. So now it's pretty much not usable, which is unfortunate because it's pretty cool. So then to replace that, and as ROS2's main planner, and since we use ROS2, that's our main SLAM algorithm, is SLAM Toolbox. SLAM Toolbox is of this graph SLAM, and it's essentially a derivative of everything else on the screen. It's cool. I would recommend you use it if you're going to do SLAM. It's a bit of a pain to configure, but it's very, very good once you get it working. It's actually, you can see it working on the bottom right. It can map very consistently for very large areas, which is cool. If you saw that same map with Gmapper or something, I don't know if you can see the little robot running around in there. It's a massive warehouse. It would just start smearing over time, which is one of the benefits of the newer techniques. So another way you can do SLAM, and just something I think is personally very cool, is vSLAM. So vSLAM is just SLAM, but you use a camera instead of a LiDAR or whatever. This is really cool, mainly because, one, cameras are really cheap. Well, relative to an $8,000 LiDAR, this little $200 camera in front of me, very cheap. Cameras are also just common. They're small, they're light. You can put them in behind like protective things. And it also, cameras work in 3D because the images are 3D, which means you can map in 3D without, again, buying the $8,000 LiDAR. And so with this, you can see, like in the bottom right, vSLAM is able to essentially find significant, what's known in computer vision as feature points. Essentially, it's corners of things. It tracks like specific instances of corners, basically, tracks them over time, and then, like I mentioned earlier with VIO, kind of tries to find the difference between frames, and then basically how far you've moved between those frames is where your pose is between those frames. It's still very complicated, but it leads to really cool results. The main issue with vSLAM is the issues with cameras and it just being complex in terms of code. But it's going to have issues with low light. It's going to have issues with things getting on the camera. It's like in the snow, probably not that great. In the fog, also probably not that great. But this is a very, very, very big area of research. Actually, U of M itself, or mostly Ann Arbor, of course, actually does a lot of research into this because of autonomous cars. Like famously, Tesla only uses this simply because it's very appealing to get away from $8,000 LiDARs. So two main implementations of this you'll see in the wild are OrbSLAM. This is the one that U of M does some research on. And RTAP Map. I love RTAP Map, mainly because if you have an iPhone after 11, they ported this to the iPhone. I don't know why. But it turns out iPhone 12s and newer, I believe, have a LiDAR on them, actually. And RTAP Map is kind of unique in that it's like a hybrid vSLAM. So it's vSLAM in that it's using a camera, but it actually also takes a LiDAR input, which is really interesting. And so I highly recommend trying this out just for fun if you have a phone that can do it, because it'll make a 3D map, like again in that forest in the bottom right there. And it's shocking how accurate it is in terms of mapping. So this is something that I hope a team at some point tries to take this on TinyCart. Just slap a camera on that you already have a LiDAR, because this is a really cool technique. That's very interesting, if nothing else. All right, so OBS in the actual recording decided to not do that whole recording thing. So I'm going to do a post. What was the rest of the presentation? Because I think this is kind of important. So where we left off, we had vSLAM, which is just another SLAM technique. So now we have a map of our environment, our absolute position inside of that map, and Odom's still there. Odom's always around. That gives us velocity. That's always useful. So if you think of our original problem of getting from A to B, we now have actually everything we need, because we have our map of what is around us. That's a prerequisite to knowing, of course, where we are in that map, which gives our A point of the A to B. And then Odom just helps with that whole thing. But given that, we can plan our path. Finally, this is where it decides to get considerably easier again, which is always nice, because up until now it's been getting increasingly absurd. And you may have even seen a lot of these algorithms in your courses. I know 350 actually covers A-star, which you see on your left there. But really, we've mentioned it multiple times, but that question of how do we get from A to B, while complicated to reach this point, now is simply how do we get from A to B. And so this is the question of planning, essentially finding the optimal path. Path is the data structure we're looking for here between A and B. And like we mentioned at the beginning, we do have to consider kinematic constraints. So this is because our robot isn't just, in a ball that can roll anywhere or do anything. Like if you're thinking about the RC cars, they have a minimum turning radius. Like you can't do the old, back out of your driveway, turn 90 degrees in place and drive down the street. You got to do a 3-point turn. So do the cars. And so you got to make sure that the path that you're given is what's called kinematically feasible, or otherwise known as physically possible. This is a big concern that makes planning a little more unique than just shortest path. But nonetheless, because we have this map, now remember this map is going to be a grid of squares that are generally like a couple inches big. They're pretty small. It's going to be a lot. It's going to be a big graph. But technically speaking, this is a graph in the computer science definition, which means that finding the shortest distance between 2 points on that graph, like avoiding obstacles, very obviously, this is just the shortest path problem. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a very good chance you've actually already seen this in a class. It's very, very well studied since the 1950s. See Dijkstra's algorithm, traveling salesman problem, all that. That's all this is. And so because of that, there's a absolutely ridiculous number of algorithms you can use. So the two I've seen the most are A-star and RRT. So A-star, again, if you've taken the AI class here, or even just done much in programming, you've probably seen A-star before. A-star is the left algorithm you see here.
So essentially what it does is starts from that red point in the top left. That would be A, or our robot. Then there's green, which is our goal. And so what A star does is essentially just repeatedly choose points until it reaches the goal, and then forms essentially like a front that spreads out by selecting the next cheapest point to go to. And how A star works is it uses a heuristic. So essentially, it's biased towards heading towards the goal, or it's biased away from heading away from the goal, even if that goes through walls and such. So you'll see like right now how it kind of blobs and then goes straight to the goal. That's what this heuristic does, and that's what makes A star much faster than like something like Dijkstra's algorithm that's pretty much just look at every possible path. Nonetheless, though, this is just essentially better Dijkstra's, because it still leads to the optimal path, which is pretty impressive actually. If you look at what it's doing, it doesn't look like that would be the case. But that's A star's biggest strength. It is mathematically proven to be the fastest path you can take at the current moment, which is very desirable, obviously, since, I mean, optimal is good. We like that. The issue with A star, though, and why it's kind of challenging to apply to robotics, well, this is definitely overcomable, but something to consider, is that A star will just give you the optimal path. It doesn't care if that's, like, you can do it. Like, it could be require the 90 degrees in place thing I mentioned earlier. So A star generally needs to be modified to be made kinematically feasible, or you can make up with it for it in path trackers, which we'll cover in a second. But it turns out there's an algorithm that can just do that out in the first place, and that is RRT. So RRT is rapidly expanding random trees, I believe. But essentially you see it on the right here. It's almost like a fractal of branches that expand out until you reach your goal. And while it looks absurd, what it's really doing here is essentially adding random points around these branches, and then if the line that's created by connecting the branch with your new random point, if that like arc, or I mean it's a line, but essentially an arc, is physically possible under your constraints, so thinking about turning radius, thinking about speed, that sort of thing, if it's physically possible for the car to make that turn, then it'll add it to the tree. And so the advantage of this is that once you have a path, like it should in a second here, that path is guaranteed to be actually physically traversable by your vehicle, which is obviously extremely advantageous. The problem with this is that it's random, and because it's random, it can't be optimal just by how that works. So you do have that disadvantage, but nonetheless, RT is still a very, very interesting approach to doing this, and it can also adapt to dynamic scenarios. Because of its branching nature, you can just cut off some branches, find the next path that is created once those are cut off. Pretty simple, but nonetheless, a very, very useful algorithm that has many, many derivatives, much like A star. Now, I should mention that these aren't like the only two. These are very common, and RT and A star, most of what you'll see. But each problem has its own unique solutions. So like, for example, if you see on the bottom right here, I just found this right before presenting this. This was a paper on autonomous FSAE over in Europe, an algorithm they use to stay in the middle of their lanes. And it uses, basically, it's just making a bunch of triangles and then finding the midpoint of those triangles and then just finding the curve through those, which is pretty unique. Obviously, it's very application specific, but that's fine because that solves their problem. So path planning, if you're going to try and do anything unique, it's probably in path planning. It's a very, very interesting field because it's very, very flexible in its approaches. Now, if you think about, like, say, this curve here, or less so A star, but more RRT, how do we actually like hold this? Because it's just a curve. So we don't hold like the polynomial of these curves. That would be ridiculous. Instead, we essentially just sample that curve and then store those points. So if you think, like, let's say we had a line from where I am to like my door. You don't store that whole curve. Rather, you'd say like, oh, every few inches or every few feet, more realistically, we store essentially like a waypoint or like a breadcrumb. And then given these samples of that curve, the robot is still able to follow that entire curve because it can just go from breadcrumb to breadcrumb to breadcrumb to follow the same overall path. The problem with this, as you can probably imagine, is that, okay, cool, we have samples of one of these paths, but how do we actually like figure out how to go from one point to another? Like, we essentially just reduce the problem to a smaller problem of A to breadcrumb instead of A to B. And that's a good point. That's actually a very big concern. So we actually can't just use another planar, because obviously if we just use A star again, then we'll just get smaller points that achieves nothing. So instead we have to use a completely separate class of algorithms to do this. And this whole problem is called path tracking, or local planning, or like path control. It has a bunch of names, but I'm going to use path tracking since I think it's the most obvious. So essentially path tracking is just another algorithm to determine like what is the command to actually send to the motors to keep on this like breadcrumb trail. Essentially from your current position to the next point on your paths, your sampled path. Well, how do we take that basically? And so this approach is very good in general, because by using these, like breadcrumbs, like I keep mentioning, we can account for the fact that realistically the robot was never staying on that path in the first place, because there's a ton of error. Everything has error. It's the real world. That's just how it is. And so, for example, if you like slip off the path or whatever, it gives it a chance to correct itself. But you can also do things like react to obstacles that jump in front of you that A star may have not have considered. That's always useful. And other advantages like this. And so there's just hundreds of ways you could do this. 3 really common approaches I see. Pure pursuit is definitely the most common. What pure pursuit is essentially, given my current location, the localization, and given the next breadcrumb, I want to just find the arc between me and that point and just take it. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's essentially all it is. So most importantly, it doesn't actually avoid anything in the way. It just tries to get to that point. So it's incredibly quick, incredibly simple. Like if you're debugging, use this, because like it's so simple. But not being able to dynamically avoid things, doesn't work for everyone. So there are other approaches. One of which is TEB. TEB is cool. I actually don't know if it dynamically avoids, but what TEB is more like control-based approach to optimize paths. It's very complicated, but it's very cool. It can do things like optimize like racing corners and such over time. It's pretty neat. But then the one I would recommend using most of the time, and what I use most of the time, is DWB, or dynamic. It's like a dynamic window approach, I believe is what it's called. Basically what you do is you generate a ton of arcs that you could take to get to the next point, and then it ranks them. So it could be things like, how close does it actually get you to the next point? How much do we turn, for example, if you want the robot to stay straight? How fast are we going if you want it to stay slow? Do we avoid obstacles more or not? Because that's a concern. And basically, you can choose how these are weighted, so you have to do a lot of calibration. But once it's calibrated, you can have it be very application specific of how do we want to get to the next point. And more so because it has so many paths, you can actually dynamically avoid things, which is very useful. But that tuning is a concern. It's not simple. We've tried it, and it kind of worked, but it's complicated. So just do keep that in mind if you choose it. But nonetheless, I believe this is what's currently being used on like the reference TinyCart. So it's out there. All right, so now if we think what we have now is an arc. Given this arc, we want to like do it. How do we do it? And it turns out this is where we get into math. But each robot can be modeled with its kinematic properties. I believe, sorry if my terms are slightly off, I'm not an ME. But basically, generally robots fall into like 5 or so general categories of how their steering works. So like for TinyCart, this is Ackerman. For something like a Roomba, that would be differential drive. Those 2 are the most common from my experience, but there are others like Mechanium, those cool Swiss wheel things, and even more. But basically, all these are just the geometry of basically what path the robot will take given its configured wheels. So like in the example of the RC cars, you have the angle of the tires and the velocity of the rear axle. In the case of a Roomba, you have the velocities of the 2 wheels. And basically, these models are able to tell you geometrically what is the arc that the vehicle will take given those parameters. And you can also do this in reverse. Given an arc, how do we get to that arc? And of course, that's the question we have, because these algorithms here, these have all given us arcs. So now finally, if we just do some trig with these equations, we can find the actual parameters we need to do, like physically, electronically, to get the car to take that path. And so these are actually pretty simple once you derive them. A lot of these you can just look up. Same with, I think we have the Ackerman ones written down somewhere. But basically, you'll just feed the arc into the equation. You'll get the parameters to control the cart, and finally, you feed it to the car. So in technical terms, these are commands to actuators. It's like your command to the RC car would be steering and velocity, because that's the only two things you can do because it's two-wheel drive. It'll send, well, you'll generate that command, and then electrically you just have to control it. This is outside of this presentation now, but this is things like on the SC cars, you have to control the servo for the steering and the ESC for the main motor. All of this as well, you should be aware, isn't that simple in and of itself. I'm not going to explain it because it's kind of outside of my field. But this falls into control. I know a lot of the ECE classes cover this, but essentially you want the motor to say, like, given a speed of, like, I want the car to go 10 miles an hour to take the turn, or 10 meters per second or something, to take the arc that we were given. How do we actually get the motor to constantly do 10 meters per second is the question. And so that falls into control theory. That's where you get like PID loops and such. But given that, we now actually have the entire stack. So in the bottom right here, you can actually see pretty much everything we've presented. So you can see, like, it almost forms like a loop. So if we start with our sensors, we read from our sensors, we're going to perceive. In this case, our perception is things like building the map, localizing, etc. Once we have that map, once we have our position in that map, then we can go through planning. And then once we have that, like, master plan, those breadcrumbs, then we just do the, like, micro planning in between each of those. And then finally, we actually have to execute the physical control to make sure we're keeping with that plan. And so I should mention this all happens at variable rates. Oop, oh no spoilers. What is this? Anyways, so all of this runs at different rates. So generally, you're going to keep replanning. Like, you don't just keep one almighty plan for all time. You're going to run A-star multiple times. So basically, A-star would be running at something like 20 hertz. Your path planning would be running at something like 60 hertz, and control would be just ridiculously fast. So the idea is that your big expensive planning happens occasionally, but still keeps up to account for things like SLAM discovering new areas of the map. But your smaller planning needs to run fast in order to not slide away from the path, because you'll see it like wiggling away from the line if it's not running fast enough, since it can't account for the small inaccuracies that happen that path tracking is designed to account for. And then control, of course, as I mentioned before, needs to run very quickly because that's at the speed of mechanics and electronics. But given that, it all forms a loop, because if you see, we read from sensors, we calculate odometry, we then build our map, or we localize depending on if we're using SLAM or not. We then plan, we then track, we then control. When we control, we moved, so now we need to remeasure again. We measure the sensors, we calculate new odometry, we use that odometry to relocalize. We can further build the map, we can plan some more if we want to, or we can just keep tracking the same path. And it all just forms this nice feedback loop that actually allows the robot to move. So hopefully that was clear enough. But I'd like to show off this pretty neat project I found while researching this by Stanford. If you didn't know, they're smart. That's kind of their thing. So they used, I mentioned before, TEB. TEB is a variant of MPC, Model Predictive Control. They have a lab for that, and they built this absurd creation. I forgot I could play it for you. Let's skip ahead to the cool part. But this is the kind of thing you can do with this. I don't know if you're going to be able to make a tiny cart look like this. If you can, I'd appreciate it. This is pretty neat. I won't blame you if you can't. But I mean, you could outbest Stanford if you want. But I show this mainly just to show that, like, it's a lot of work, obviously. There's a lot of math here. But that's for a good reason. You can do ridiculous nonsense. You can do useful nonsense, but you can also do ridiculous nonsense. And that's kind of what I hope Tiny Cart turns out to be. But, try to have some fun with this at the end of the day. That's what we're here for. Alright. So, hopefully this aids you in both Tiny Cart and just general understanding. We'll definitely get deeper into all this. This is not the be-all, end-all of any of these topics. Clearly, we've brushed over most of them. But this should give you a pretty good overview. I highly recommend going back to this document, just Googling these terms as you need them, really research them individually. That's just kind of what you have to do. And then you should build a better understanding over time. All right, should be it. Thanks for watching.